We'll get going. So my name is Michael Hanna, and I'm a board member of the Irvington Historical Society. Thank you for joining this presentation today. We're glad that we can continue to present it for free. We want everybody who is able to join. So we appreciate our volunteers and the financial support of members in the Village of Irvington and the county with our legislator, David Imamura, and New York State. The presentation is going to be about 45 to 60 minutes, and we do have a Q&A at the end. So at any time during the presentation, if you want to add a question to the chat, at the end, I will read those questions to our presenter today, Chet Kerr. And I do want to remind everyone that this presentation is copyrighted by the Historical Society and our presenter, Chet Kerr. So should only be shared by our society without express permission. And I will now turn it over to our chair for the Society's programming to introduce the presentation. So Sarah Kelsey, if you want to take it over.
Thanks, Michael. Chet Kerr, our speaker today, retired in 2016 after over 30 years as a successful litigator in New York City. But luckily for Irvington, its resident of over 25 years did not rest on his laurels. His whirlwind retirement includes teaching and serving on numerous nonprofit boards dealing with the environment, land use, civil rights, the arts, and history. But Chet needs no introduction to many of you who attended the Irvington Historical Society Zoom programs during the pandemic and thereafter. Chet hosted the Zooms and presented many programs focused on aspects of our village history, its people, and its places. At the same time, he mightily improved the Society's website, as you may have noticed, and its use of technology. A key project of Chet's was to organize and digitize the combined map collections of the Society and the Irvington Public Library, providing the public with easy access to the maps. Chet's presentation today demonstrates the results of this achievement. Chet?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Scott and Michael. And Scott, maybe you want to turn your camera off. There you go. Okay. So welcome, everybody. Let me see if I can share my screen. If I can get to the place I need to get to. Okay, I think we're up.
Looks good.
Okay, so our talk today is about Irvington's historical maps and the stories they tell. And you'll hear a little bit about how we created this digitized maps system, but I think what I hope to convey today is, as I said, the stories that lie behind the maps. These maps give a perspective on the village's history, and they tell a lot about the people who've lived here over the years. But in going through this presentation and developing it, they also tell a very interesting story about the village itself, and many of the changes it's gone through, and the kind of challenges it's had over the years, many of which reverberate today. So when we get to there, you'll see there's stories of growth of the village, stories of housing, stories of infrastructure, stories of traffic, and interesting stories of the dynamic of changing wealth in the community, and how different groups within the village coexisted and tried to find in their own way what the village had to offer them. And I raise all this because I think this is some of the stories that we still talk to each other about today, so it's just an interesting background for all of this. So let's get started. So Irvington has long had kind of a trove of original and unique historical maps that have been locked away in the archives of the Irvington Historical Society and the Irvington Public Library, often unseen and unknown by most people. And I discovered these collections of old maps in 2017 while I was researching the history of the Irvington Woods in another hat I wear on the Greater Irvington Land Trust. And these maps, which are original, Included maps of some of the large gilded estates in the early village, the neighborhoods, some of the developments that were created as the village grew, and the homes and property of private homeowners. And the sources of these maps is often not clear. Some have either been donated by long ago residents who've been cleaning out attics and finding something and going and giving it to the Historical Society. Some have been collected by local history buffs and some by the village's own historians. And in 2018, the Irvington Historical Society began a discussion about what were the ways we could make these maps accessible to people, and because they were frankly hidden away in the Historical Society's archives. And I reached out to Rosemary Gatzik, who was the Irvington librarian, and she was also interested in how do we make the library's maps available to the public. And we were both concerned that to ensure that the maps themselves, which are old and very fragile, would still be protected. But if we could find a way of digitizing them and putting them up on a website that folks could access, that would be a great thing. So we began the map digitization project in 2019, but it was then stalled by the pandemic. In early 2022, I kind of renewed these discussions with Rosemary and Veronica Gedrich, who was the Historical Society president, about making these maps public. And we spent time in looking for funding to do this. We submitted several grant applications that we did not get. But luckily for everybody, at the suggestion of David Imamura, we applied for funding under the County of Westchester's Community-Based Organization Funding Program. And I think most of you probably know David. David is a longtime resident of the village. He is our county legislator in the Westchester County of Legislators, and just frankly a great guy, and very village-oriented and very focused on finding ways of helping all the communities in I think it's District 12 of the Westchester County to kind of do things. And so we applied, and under David's great leadership, the county agreed to fund $13,000 in support of this project, which turned out more than enough of what we needed to do. So what is the process we went through for doing this? Well, we were very lucky to be able to work with Jennifer Palmentiero of the Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. That's kind of a mouthful, but it's an organization set up regionally around New York that supports libraries and historical societies. And Jennifer is a genius at using technology to bring out into the public materials that have been in archives. And but to do this, we had to create essentially a database of metadata about all of our maps. So what I mean by that is to be able to host the maps in a digital archive, you have to collect and consistent information across the maps that are done with the right terminology in a way so that you can search for them, you can identify them, you can consistently name them. And on the left is a description of items that I created using the Library Resources Council's database instructions of the kinds of information I need to collect for each maps. And over the course of about 15 months, I reviewed over 300 original maps in the library and the Historical Society and created two large spreadsheets of key metadata information, which was in and of itself sometimes a tedious but a very interesting process. And then in September of 2024, we shipped 160 maps to HF Global facilities in North Carolina to be digitized. And HF Global is this great company down there that have very sophisticated ways of digitizing stuff. And in deciding which maps to digitize, we were looking for original, unique maps that reflect Irvington and its history. There are a number of maps in the collections, copies of Atlas maps that were kind of published broadly and that are available elsewhere online, and we didn't digitize those. So this was a very select group that we decided to proceed with. And HF Global did its magic, and then in March of 2025, the historical maps all became available as part of a digital collection on the Empire State Library's network, New York Heritage website. And for those of you who may not know about this website, it is really a fantastic place to find history all across New York. It allows archival collections of local libraries, local historical societies, and similar organizations to put up information that is accessible. You can download it and review it all. And the library had already put up a series of photographs from its collection, and our map collection is now up there. The Historical Society is going to be putting up some additional materials over the next 2 months, I believe. And so all the maps we see today and we talk about today are available on this website. You can review them all. You can download them and kind of look at them and whatever. And so it's a really great resource. So let's turn to what I want to talk about today, which is stories from all these maps that we've done. And this quote is something I really like. Maps are a way of organizing wonder. And I'm a bit of I like maps. What can I say? And Peter Steinhardt, who is the author of this, he was a naturalist. He is a naturalist and a writer. And for many years, he wrote for Audubon, and his work has appeared in a wide range of publications. But this kind of captures for me the kinds of things that I find in maps, and I hope that I can convey a little bit today to all of you about some of the wonder and the stories that come out of the maps that we have now got up in our system. So what I'm going to do is go through a series of maps that I went through and chose a group of them that each of them tell different stories in their own way, and we're going to talk about each. So the first map I want to talk about is actually an 1820s Hudson River map. And actually what it is, it's a bound leather copy, a bound book that has 15 separate maps in it, done in 1820, of areas running up and down the Hudson River. And it was published by a guy named Andrew Goodrich, who was a New York bookseller, who had a shop on Lower Broadway in Manhattan. And in the 1820s, there weren't as many public libraries, if any. And so people either had books in their own collection, or they'd have to go to a bookstore. And there was a growing small group of bookstore owners in New York City. And Peter Goodrich ran a circulating library, so people could take out books. And he also published books and maps is his way. And so this book of maps, as I said, runs from Sandy Hook on the northern end of New Jersey, and depicts the Hudson River all the way up to a place called Sandy Hills, which at that time was a city north of Albany. And Sandy Hills is where Hudson Falls is today. And what I wanted to focus on is this map. This is a map from the book, and it reflects the Hudson River and what's called the Post Road that ran from New York up to Albany. And the Post Road was an old Indian trail. That is what is Broadway today. And this depicts the area from Kingsbridge in the south. Kingsbridge was the bridge between Manhattan and the Bronx, up to about the southern part of Tarrytown. And on the right, I have highlighted the area that is shown on this map between Dobbs Ferry and, again, the southern end of Tarrytown. And interesting to see the kinds of things that were depicted on this map. Again, this map was largely for travelers who would be riding up and down the Post Road. And so at this time in the 1820s, let me step back. After the Revolutionary War, Phillipsburg Manor, which was the 52,000 acre area on the east side of the Hudson River, had been confiscated by New York State because Frederick Phillips, the owner of it all, had been a loyalist to the King of England. And after the Revolutionary War, a group of commissioners of forfeiture sold the farms that made up Phillipsburg Manor largely to the local tenant farmers who had been on that property and who had supported the colonists. And in Irvington, there were essentially 5 farms that were sold that made up what is today what we know of as Irvington. It was northern end, a farm sold to Abraham Acker, then a farm to William Dutcher, a farm to John Jewell, a farm to Jonathan Odell, and then at the very southern end, a farm that was owned by Jasper Stuymas, which kind of laid over partly Dobbs Ferry and partly Irvington. And these are some of the names that you still hear in Irvington. So what are these references on the maps? The Odell's Tavern is really a reference to Odell's Tavern, which was owned and operated by a guy named William Odell, who was the son of Jonathan Odell, who had purchased this large farm after the Revolutionary War. And for those of you in Irvington, you probably know about Odell's Tavern. It is actually located on the property at 100 South Broadway, just south of Dow's Lane. And it is one of the oldest homes in all of Westchester County, if not New York State. It was actually originally built in 1693 by a guy named Jan Harmas, and it still stands there. And it's a beautiful old building. It's on private property, but it really has a lot of history to it. And for those of you who have been following what's been going on with 250, the 250 effort about the Revolutionary War, which is kind of being kicked off in 2026 big time, there's going to be more information about the Odell Tavern coming out. The second item on this map is a reference to Dutcher, and this is the homestead of William Dutcher Jr., the son of William Dutcher. And again, for those of folks in Irvington know, the Dutcher farm, the southern part of the Dutcher farm, was ultimately in 1850 became what is now the Main Street area of Irvington. It was sold by a later owner. The next item is on the map we just showed was for Acker's Tavern. And this is a reference to Acker's Tavern, which was owned and operated by Abraham Acker III and his wife, Jemima Dutcher. And the Acker's Tavern was on the west side of today's Broadway at about where 41 North Broadway is, which is a little just north of Matheson, the entrance to Matheson Park. And it was also a tavern. Again, the Odell's Tavern, Acker's Tavern were the 2 taverns in this area where travelers going up the Post Road could stop and stay and stuff like that. And then the final name in here is a really interesting character, a guy named Charles Pindar, who was a sea captain born in Russia. And in 1870, his wife, Susan Pindar, bought a 7-acre estate between what is today Sunnyside, the old Washington Irvington place in Sunnyside, and the old Croton Aqueduct on the north side of Sunnyside Lane West. And they named their home Pindar's Vale. And that home continued on through a long legacy of Irvington history. He was appointed the Russian consul at Pensacola, Florida, after Spain ceded control over Florida in 1821. And he moved to Florida and defaulted on his property. And that property was purchased by Washington Irving's nephew, Oliver Irving. So the second map I wanted to show you is a kind of a partial map of Westchester County, circa 1851. And again, those of you who have been to prior presentations by the Historical Society and by me know that Irvington was created in 1850. And so this map reflects part of Westchester County just after Irvington, well, actually what was called Dearman at the time, was founded. And I've highlighted the area here around this area. And so you'll see the area Dearman, and that shaded area shows the Main Street area as originally done. And you'll see around it some of the names, the long-term names that are kind of well known in this area. Just in the south, you'll see uh, James Hamilton. That's the Nevis estate. North of that is the John Jewell farm. North of Dearman is a large property of what became Matheson Park, which was owned by Jabaz Ellis. And then other names, James Acker, Benjamin Ferris, uh, Irving up in where Sunnyside is. And another interesting thing is you can see on the right, the shaded area, that's the hill area that today makes up the Irvington Woods. And it was then known as Beaver Hill. It was because there was really a lot of beavers in that area next to the Sawmill River over there. So again, it just kind of goes back and tells a little bit of the texture of the history of this area. So going back to the creation of Irvington, as I said, in about 1848, a proposed new train running up and down the east side of the Hudson River which became the Hudson River Railroad. And in 1849, regular train service began on the Hudson River Railroad. And that transformed what this area was. Up until this point, it was basically largely farmland. But this just opened up a way for people in the city to suddenly think about coming up here relatively quickly. And again, for those of you who have been to prior presentations, know that the village of Dearman or Irvington was created in 1850, in part in a result of this thing. But the thing that many of you may not know is about a half a mile south, another group of investors prepared a map for a new village called Abbotsford, which was the area which kind of centered on today's Clinton Avenue, both on the east and west side of Broadway. And it was designed to have relatively small lots. It was for much of the new immigrants that were coming into this area, and a way for some of the people who lived in New York City who wanted to escape the city but didn't have money to buy large summer estates, a way to move up here. It turned out that this area of Abbotsford, the area on the west side of Broadway, was never developed like this. They actually remained largely large estates. But the area of East Clinton on the east side of Broadway was developed with relatively small lots, and that became one of the kind of areas of the new immigrants that were part of what the fabric of Irvington became. And again, for those of you who got a chance to see the exhibit about a year ago at the Irvington Historical Society about immigration, this is one of the areas that was kind of focused on in that, because it really rough. It had small homes that were owned by some of the new immigrants and the merchants and the laborers who worked in the larger estates. And this map, and I think this issue about creating this immigrant kind of homeland, picks up on something that you're going to see in later maps, and that is the tug and pull between some of the larger estates that were funded by very large, successful business people in New York City, and the local populace of merchants and laborers who also moved up here to support those larger estates that often lived on East Clinton, lived along Main Street or East Irvington. The other thing that happened was the kind of the growth of the great estates. Before 1850, before the creation of the Village of Irvington, there had been a couple of large properties been purchased. James Hamilton purchased the estate that would become Nevis in 1835, and that was in the southern part of today's Irvington. And then Washington Irving had purchased his Sunnyside estate along the Hudson River as kind of an escape for him. But other than those two larger properties, most of the land in the prior to 1850 and 1860 was still the farmland. It was still farmland owned by some of the families that had purchased after the Revolutionary War. But with the train service coming in, with the creation of Dearman's, the new Irvington, that changed dramatically, especially in the 1850s and 1860s. And what happened was a bunch of speculators came in, purchased up a bunch of the farms, and started selling them or offering them to the business elite in New York as summer estates, a way to get up into the Hudson Valley, escape the kind of squalor of New York City, and have some large summer estates up here. And this map is a map of the property belonging to Charles Tiffany and James Dunham. And you'll see that on the right-hand side, you'll see Broadway. On the left, you'll see the Hudson River. Their large estate extended from Broadway down to the Hudson River. You'll see the train line through that on the left-hand side. And then actually on here, it shows a little bit of a park, and that's today's Matheson Park, which was part of the original Tiffany estate. And so Charles Tiffany and James Lawrence, as I said, purchased this property in 1863. It had been the western portion of a large farm that had been owned by a guy named Jabez Ellis, who had been Tiffany's business partner. And Tiffany owned and managed Tiffany & Co., which sold European jewelry, diamonds and silver and gold jewelry manufactured in the United States. And he was an incredibly successful businessman. He kind of touched on and found the interests of a lot of very wealthy people in New York City that were interested in jewelry. James Dunham was his nephew, but he was a well-to-do person in his own right. He was the vice president and director of the Corn Exchange Bank, which was a big commodity bank at the time. Well, initially, Tiffany and Dunham bought this property together and then divided it up to build homes for different members of their respective families. Ultimately, the Dunhams sold their interest in the property to Tiffany, and that it was really the Tiffany family who continued to own the estate from 1863 until Charles Tiffany's death in 1902. And that area, that property, is what we often think of today as Matheson Park here in Irvington. But the thing that I really found interesting about this map of the Tiffany and Dunham estate was a reference to property owned just north of their estate, which was a land owned by a man named John Duncan. And again, I think this is one of the stories that I think is just so interesting about Irvington. In 1852, John Duncan purchased about 17.5 acres from the Acker family and to create a summer estate himself, and it ran from Broadway to the Hudson River. And he originally immigrated from Scotland, and in 1819 he started a business in rare and fine groceries in New York City. And it was kind of the Zabars of early 1820s. And what he would do is he would go down, sea captains who sailed from Europe over to the New World, to America, often to supplement their income. They would put in their personal stock, they would bring over specialty goods, and they would get to New York and they would sell those specialty goods. And John Duncan and his store built these relationships with sea captains, and that he would buy unique products that would come over and then offer that to the kind of the new growth of wealthy people in New York City. And in 1839, the Duncans imported several bottles of this new product called Lee and Perrin's Worcester sauce. And it had never been come to the United States before. And they got it, and realizing its potential, they immediately became the exclusive distributor for Lee and Perrin's in the United States. And this turned out to be an incredibly successful business, which the Duncans marketed across the United States for the next 60 years. And they worked very hard to make sure that they were the exclusive distributor of Lee and Perkins Worcestershire sauce. And they made millions from doing this. And Worcestershire sauce, who knew, but it was really an interesting story in and of itself. It was invented by accident by two chemists in London, John Lees and William Perrins, in 1835. There was an English lord named Lord Sandys who had just returned from India, and he was now back in London, and was very interested in to see if he could recreate some of the flavors and the taste of India he had had over there, including some of the sauces. So he went to these two chemists and said, "Can you create this sauce for me? This fabulous sauce I had, and here are the ingredients that I think you should put into this." And so John Lees and William's parents said, "We could do that." And they went down to their lab and created this concoction, and they tasted it, and it was horrible. It was basically tar, and it was just a complete failure. And Lord Sandys was really unhappy with them. It was just a complete social faux pas. So they just put it down in their basement and forgot about it. And about 18 months later, however, they went down there and pulled it out and tasted it. And it had completely transformed. It had fermented, and it developed into this delicious, complex flavor, which was very unique. And at that time, there was not a lot of ways to preserve meat and things. And so often you had to use strong sauces to kind of bring out the flavor in it, so to speak. And so they realized the potential of this, and they released it commercially in 1837 as the Lee and Perrins Worcestershire sauce. And so the reason I tell this story is it just ties back to Irvington. One of the things that Irvington has that probably most people don't know about, it was the John Duncan family lived here, and they were the purveyors of this the exclusive purveyors in the United States for almost 60 years, and made a lot of money out of it. So another map I want to point out are the Crawford insurance maps of Irvington. And insurance maps was a concept that originated in London at the end of the 18th century. These large fire insurance companies wanted to know how to underwrite large swaths of London, but there's a variety of different buildings, and how do they put on risk? And so they would get map makers to go around and create very accurate information about the buildings they were insuring, specifically what they were made out of and how they might survive in a fire. And this practice ultimately extended to the United States, and a number of companies prepared these maps, but ultimately the Sanborn Map Company covered the field, and many of you may have heard of Sanborn Maps. This map, the Crawford insurance map of Irvington, however, it could have been published by Sanborn and then used by a local insurance agent here in the Irvington area by plapping their name on it. But it would depict the buildings that made up Irvington, and this is in 1889. And so the maps we have in our collection from back then depict in great detail what the Main Street area of Irvington looked like at the time. And it's really kind of, I think, fascinating in the stories it tells about that part of the village. So we're going to look at the first map, which showed the southern end of Main Street between what was then known as A Street and B Street. For those of you who know, today the streets in Irvington have names like Astor and Buckout, whatever, but for many, many years, they were simply known as A Street, B Street, C Street, and D Street, and so on. In this map, on the left side, which is the south side of Main Street, was the Lord Horticultural Manufacturing Company, which later became Lord and Burnham and in 1890. And as most of you know, Lord and Burnham was the premier manufacturer of glass garden enclosures around the country and much around the world for many, many years. The large enclosure at Lyndhurst was done by this. The ones at the New York Botanical Gardens was built by Lord of Burnham. And this was a major industry in the town of, in the village of Irvington. The notes on the left, which may be hard for you to read, but they said that the factory employed 30 hands who worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that was probably kind of standard at the time. Interesting, the side of Main Street between A and B Street also had the C.A. Adams Express Stables. And that's kind of where Rich Weiler has his dentist practice today, or had his dentist practice. And these express stables, they were express businesses. In the late 1840s, the Postal Service really wasn't capable of moving packages and couldn't really provide insurance. So a new business, express businesses, was created that would, either using horses or carriages, or as trains were being built, using trains to move packages around in a way that was bonded and could provide insurance. And this was one of the express stables in Irvington. And then on the right of your screen, on the north side, especially of A Street, which is today Astor Place, across from the Irvington Railroad Station, this was one of the major business districts of Irvington at the time. And it had an American Express office, a grocery, a saloon, a plumbing store, a harness store, a hardware store, and then at the very right, the Henry H. Cannon Feed and Grain Store, which was one of the long-standing businesses here in Irvington. Henry Cannon made his mark in the village for many, many years. And some of these buildings still stand, though not in different formats. As you know, some of the brick buildings along Astor Street reflect what was then these buildings, as shown on this map. And then one thing to point out on this, on the corner of B Street and Main, on the northwest corner, was a hotel. It was called Main Street Hotel. And at this time, there were several hotels in Irvington. And they also always had a saloon. And one thing that's fun about these maps, there's a lot of saloons in Irvington at the time. And to reflect perhaps the socializing of the local populace along the Main Street, which were largely an immigrant population, and they went and enjoyed their drinking for sure. So this is a map, another Crawford Insurance map of the area along Main Street between D Street and F Street, so Dutcher and Ferris Street today. And this was the other kind of central business district as you go halfway up the hill in Irvington. And at the corner of D Street, the northeast corner, on the north side of Main Street and D, was Abercrombie Grocery, which operated here in Irvington from about 1860 to 1930, and then for many years after that as Gristedes. And there are still people who live here in the village who can remember Gristedes at the time. And then along that block, there were a lot of other small stores that were kind of the backbone of the community. A lot of them are owned by immigrants and newly arrived people here in the United States. And then this map also shows two more hotels, again at the corner of Main and E Street. On the north side is Bush's Hotel. And then further up E Street is Union Hotel, which had this gigantic beer garden, which was also something that was kind of a part of Irvington life for many, many years. The map also shows on the corner of E Street and Main on the east side, the St. Paul's Methodist Church. It was a church, I can't remember exactly when it was built, probably about the 1870s, 1860s. That church is still here. It's the Isabel Benjamin Recreation Center. That's where our rec department is. And then at the very northern end of F Street, you see at the very upper right-hand corner of this map is the Irvington Fire Association. And that was again, in partly reflected on this map, it was something that was created to deal with fires. And the Irvington Fire Association is another interesting story about the Irvington. It was established in April of 1880 with about 38 members, and they purchased a handheld, hand-drawn engine for $372 and rented this two-story building on North Fair Street at the end. And it was later incorporated to the Irvington Fire Association, and it grew to 59 members. And when Town Hall was built, it moved from this small location into the Town Hall building. This photo is from about 1894 when that bell was put on. But I think another story these maps tell is of things like this, of people living in this village who saw a need that was not really couldn't be supplied by the municipal government, which was just kind of newly formed at this point in time, and the hard work of volunteers getting together and really making their impact. And you see that again and again and again over the history of the village. You see it today. There's a lot of people who put time and effort in. And I personally think one of the stories these maps talk about is how important that is to do, to make the village that all of us want it to be. And it takes a dedicated group of people who put their time and effort in to make it work. And the Irvington Fire Association, which is today the volunteer fire department, has been doing this since 1880. And then the final map, the Crawford map, is at the very northern end, which is Broadway and at H Street. And interesting, on the corner of the northern corner of H and Broadway, it was the C.R. Doremus Carriage Inc. factory. And that brick building is still located at that corner. Just next to that was a building, if you see, it says stone basement and dwelling, and that is today where the Irvington Historical Society's History Center is. The two houses that are directly across the street at the corner of H and Broadway on the south side, those two houses still stand. And actually, the second one in from H Street was originally the location of Justice Dearman's home, which was the farmhouse that was here when the village was created originally. The house at the very corner, that was recently redone. It's actually a beautiful home. But again, it is shown on this map. So let's move on to the post-Civil War expansion of the village. And with the creation of the new Village of Dearman in Irvington in 1850, a number of larger properties along Broadway were sold as summer estates to wealthy New Yorkers. That became kind of up and down, especially along Northern Broadway. A large group of summer estates came. But there was a guy named Charles Harriman who had made his fortune in the sugar industry, and he began investing as a real estate just investor in Tarrytown and Irvington. And he ultimately bought almost 200 acres of land extending east from Broadway out to Cyrus Field Road, south of what is today the Harriman Road. Essentially, if you went from Broadway and rode along Harriman, all the way from Broadway out to where Cyrus Field Road is today on the south side, that was part of his real estate development. And he retained a guy named Augustus Hepp, who was the chief landscape gardener for Central Park in New York City, to design 30 of what was described the most desirable villa sites on the Hudson River. And again, just stopping and thinking about, and a number of maps we're going to talk about going forward, you just show this, what is the vision of this community? Is it designed to be homes for summer homes for the wealthy? Is it designed to be large homes year-round for people who want to move up to the village and become commuters into the New York City? Is it for smaller homes for people who aren't part of the wealthy of New York, but want to live in a community like this, a very beautiful community, and who would become local merchants and laborers and whatever? And Harriman's vision was to create essentially large villa sites for the wealthy of New York. And he sold some of these villa sites, but in 1884 he decided to move his focus down to Yonkers, and he sold the remaining undeveloped property to two guys named George and Charles Palliser. And Charles and George Palliser are also interesting in their own right. They were born in England and immigrated to the United States in 1870, and they became partners in an architectural firm called Palliser and Co., which was based up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And their approach to architecture at the time, there weren't a lot of architects in the United States or even in New York, and you usually had to be fairly wealthy to get the advantage to use an architect. What they did was they created pattern books, and so they would develop architectural drawings of kind of standard houses or cottages or villas, and they published these in books. And then people could buy these books, look through them, and find out the kind of house they wanted and use that pattern book drawing to then build it themselves or with hire some local contractors. And this was a very lucrative building business for them for a while. But they bought this property that Harriman had, which was again between Broadway and Cyrus Field, just south of Harriman. And they planned to build something similar to what Harriman had done, 50 stone mansions for New York City's merchants and bankers. That was their vision of this whole thing, of what they wanted to do. But as a lot of developers do, that they didn't get very far, and their company went into receivership. And in 1890, the receiver for what was then the Palliser group of companies put these various properties up for sale in this receiver sale. And this map, to get you self-oriented, the top of the map is headed south, the bottom of the map is heading north. Broadway would be further over on the right of the map. At the bottom, you'll see a road that says Park Avenue, that is Harriman Road. And then on the left, you'll see a road that says Midland Avenue. That's essentially where Cyrus Field was today. And so these are the parcels that were being put up for sale and put up for auction. And what is really interesting about this map I just showed you on the back is this note. And I think this note reflects a lot of things that I'm trying to talk about today. Both it's kind of the selling point of developers about both the convenience and the beauty of the village, and the growing importance of finding wealth through home sales. That resonates today. And it suggests that any property that was sold as part of this receiver sale will double in value, and the money spent on property is a safe and sure investment. And again, that kind of resonates today. But I think you look a little closer, and this reflects, however, an underlying tension at this time of what the community is and who it's there for. And then it says, the Village of Irvington is noted for its excellent class of home residents, embracing the richest and most distinguished businessmen of the country. And clearly that was who they were pitching this sale to. But what's interesting about the village at this time, over 50% of the residents of the village were immigrants who had newly arrived in the United States, mostly from Europe. They were largely poorer. Many of them were laborers or local merchants, and they could never afford these homes that was being pitched by this receiver in Sunnyside Park. And again, just an interesting juxtaposition of how real estate interests and money sometimes drive certain things that work or don't work. And I think this reflects some of those things that still go on today in our community. So the next map I'm going to show you in a minute reflects the creation of Barney Park, which is the area just south of Main Street between Continent and Ferris in Irvington. But who are the Barneys? So from 1860 to the turn of the century, much of the property between Broadway and the Hudson River, and immediately south of the Main Street area of Irvington, was made up of several large estates that were owned by members of the Barney family. There was a guy named Danford N. Barney and his brother Asheville Barney. They were the family patriarchs. And Danford Barney was a founder of American Express and the president of Wells Fargo and Company from 1853 to 1866. Asheville Barney was a banker and served as the president of Wells Fargo and Company from 1869 to 1870. And they were you read about them, and they were very esteemed members of the largest business community in New York, but they were also widely seen as in the epitome of the robber barons of the Gilded Age. And Danford Barney died in 1874, and Asheville Barney died in 1886. And after their death, their estates, including their large property in Irvington, were divided up among their children. And this map, the kind of northern part of what had been the Barney estate, which had been owned essentially by Asheville Barney, was left to Asheville Barney's children, Charles T. Barney and his sister Helena Barney. And this area, if you can see it, you'll see Main Street at the very north, and you'll see A Street, B Street, C Street, and D Street. And the areas of marked out lots, that is essentially what Barney Park is today. It's between what had been the traditional southern end of the Main Street area and just north of Barney Brook, which ran through. And this was put up by originally by Charles T. Barney, and then his sons were the president of the Barney Estate Company that held this real estate and sold it. Interesting, in 1894, the very western part of this parcel, you'll see just below Brookside Avenue, which today is Barney Place, there's a house, and that house was on the hill, kind of where the Cosmopolitan building is. And this property was sold by Charles Barney to John Brisbane Walker. And Walker also bought some of the area just south of this. And he was the person who built the Cosmopolitan building. And he had the option to move that house, which was John Jewell's original home, and he would get a reduction in his price of the sale if he moved those house over to the lots 1 and 2 on the western side of C Street. And he ended up moving that, and that original house is now the house at 26 Barney Park, in Barney Park. And where that house had been, as I said, John Brisbane Walker built the Cosmopolitan building, which still stands, and today is again part of our evolutionary part of redevelopment and rethinking of some of the buildings here in Irvington. So another development along these lines is Ardsley Park. And for those of you who have been to prior presentations of mine, you know I've talked about Ardsley Park, which was the new suburbia. And there was a explosion. And this is a description from the Real Estate Board and Builder's Guide, which talks about this is going to be a new suburban area in the area where there's 100 millionaires along the line of Hudson River. And at this time, the area on the eastern side of the Hudson between Yonkers and Tarrytown was the wealthiest part of the United States. There were people who had summer estates up there that were worth collectively over $1 billion, which was about $400 billion today. And so Ardsley Park was the vision of a man named Amzi Barber, who wanted to create this area as part of this new suburbia. And again, for those of you who've been to prior presentation, know that Amzi Barber was the asphalt king. He had begun work in Washington, D.C., had been there when the federal government decided to asphalt the front of the Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House, and he quickly realized that this was a game changer and got an exclusive right to collect asphalt from Trinidad, and ended up selling asphalt across all across the country, and made millions and millions and millions of dollars. And he moved up to New York and bought the old Cyrus Field estate, and then also land on both sides of Broadway. And he formed the syndicate to create the Ardsley Casino, which included a lot of the very wealthy people. And his vision was to develop that all into Ardsley Park. And he created the Lorena Company, which he transferred all this property to. And this quote from a brochure about Ardsley Park, again, echoes some of this tension about wealth. The immediate tract known as Ardsley on Hudson has always been beautiful. It was chosen by its present owners, Lorena Company, because it, more than any other section of the Hudson, combined all the requisites of an ideal spot, which gentlemen of wealth might erect homes and be secure and confident they'd always be free from the encroachments of unpleasant surroundings or conditions. You could read a lot into that, but that was the drive of what the vision for Ardsley Park was. And there's a number of maps of Ardsley Park at various points. This is from the 1960, number of maps in the collections that have now been digitized. And this shows how this area became transformed into the kind of community it is today. The golf course that is now the Ardsley Country Club was once reached down to the river, because that's where the Ardsley Casino was, but it's slowly transformed. And again, what I think is interesting is, again, these maps reflect the changing dynamics of ownership and home ownership in the village. Another one of those maps is Cedar Ridge. Again, Cedar Ridge is a development along the northern side of Harriman and Irvington. And this was a map that was created in about 1926. This area had originally been part of the estate of James Henry Whitehouse, but he died in May of 1924, and his estate sold it first to a man named John Hunter, who was a long-standing builder, and his family had been builders in Irvington for many years. And then it was sold to somebody named Morris Rice, who then developed Cedar Ridge. And the style of this, what's interesting, unlike Ardsley Park, this was designed for smaller lots, smaller homes, for a different strata of potential people who are moving up at this time out of New York City and thinking about living in suburbia. And the first homes were stucco English Tudor and split level, and they sold for about $13,000 to $15,000. And the original design of Cedar Ridge was for about 150 different homes. This is a map of Cedar Ridge 2 years after it was created, and it shows that most of the lots had been sold, and the little black squares are where the houses that had been built already. And you'll see that some of these houses, especially along Hillside Terrace, still exist today. They're the homes that were built back then. With the coming of the Depression, however, building was halted and some residents lost their homes, and again reflected the change in home ownership and structure of our village, some of the stories that reflect the broader things that are going on in the country. One more development I want to show to you, and that is this. This is of the Irvington Estates on North Broadway. This is today Riverview Road and Circle Drive. This had been an estate owned by the Edelston family, which ran from Broadway out to Mountain Road, and had a large mansion, which you'll see at the top, which was Strawberry Hill Mansion, which still exists up there. But they passed away in 23 or 24, and their estate sold all this property to a company that sought the development. And originally, you see the lots are actually pretty small. They're very long, narrow lots, about 25 feet wide. Many of them were sold and combined, so the homes that actually circle this area along Riverview and Circle Drive are actually on multiple lots, a little bigger. But it again demonstrates the kind of push to change and transformation of the village. Similar to Cedar Ridge, Irvington Estates was marketed to the new middle class. Again, resonating in here that that the public hadn't had an opportunity to purchase real home sites other than large estates. Irvington and Hudson had always been the home of the rich, but the day of the great estate with its castle and vast acres of unimproved land is passing, and instead, the countryside is being dotted with many smaller homes in which modern comforts and conveniences of living are paramount. And again, it reflects the changing demographics, the changing nature of the community, and things that still resonate today in a lot of ways in terms of home ownership in our village. But not all this stuff was being developed in smaller places. And we have maps in our collection of some of the remaining large estates. This is of the George Hill estate in 1930, which was at the corner of Harriman and Broadway, the southeast corner. And this was a long, large estate that had long been known as Richmond Hill. It's where the Richmond Hill development is today. And this was a beautiful estate with a tennis court, swimming pools, ponds, all kinds of fabulous places on it. And an interesting story here, this Richmond Hill was originally kind of created by a guy named Dr. Lucien Warner in 1890. He bought much of the corner of Harriman and Broadway, and he built a mansion in the south part of it. And he made his wealth by, of all things, redesigning the corset. That in the late 1800s, corsets, which was kind of the women wore in society, and they were made of bone. They'd be tightened, and you could break ribs with it. They were causing internal injury. They're incredibly uncomfortable. And this guy figured out that, I can make a more flexible version using Caroline plant fibers instead of bone. And he tried it out on his wife, and his wife thought it was great. And he ended up making corsets, and they were very popular. And he and his partners were millionaires selling corsets. But the corsets, of course, kind of declined in the early 20th century. But at about that time, there was a woman named Mary Phelps Jacob who was very frustrated with corsets, and she designed a bra for herself, which was kind of handkerchiefs tied with strings. And she got a patent for it, but didn't really know how to market it. And so Lucien Warner bought that patent in 1914 for about $1,500. And his company then became the first company to manufacture bras on a large scale. And again, it's just an interesting tie to the history of Irvington here, how these products that, necessarily associate with our village really reflected here by the people who lived here. Richmond Hill remained as a kind of a gilded summer estate for many years. After Warner, it was owned by Daniel Gray Reed, who was the tin plate king. He sold his tin company to U.S. Steel. It was later owned by George Washington Hill, who that map we showed before. He was the president of American Tobacco Company. And he was the person who introduced Lucky Strike cigarettes in 1970. It was instrumental in increasing the number of smokers in the United States, not a great legacy. Then after his death, the estate became the corporate headquarters of North American Phillips, and then later the home of Ohel Schimmel Yeshiva, Hasidic rabbinical school, and it remained the yeshiva from about 1966 till 1977 when it was destroyed in fire. So I want to move to this real quick because I know we're going on time. The other thing these stories talk about is the infrastructure in the village, and they show the backbones of the village. There's maps of sewer systems, of water systems, of roadways, and it reflects the ongoing challenges of the village as they grew and how to provide those services. And for those of you in the village know, that's still going on today. Just last year, the village created a new committee to study the need for use of village facilities. That could be about redeploying where services and offices are. And so they're not new issues. And the challenges of creating the physical plant and people, and frankly, members of the community getting involved in making those decisions are an important part of the stories of the village, and they can be found in our historical maps. So this is an interesting map from the 1940s. And to get you located, this is the downtown Main Street area. You see Main Street on the left, and you'll see the central railroad line and separating the mainland and then the area which was later became on the other side of the river, Hudson River. And you'll see the Cosmopolitan building there. And then in the middle of this is the plant site for what was going to become, and was for a series of years, a big sewage plant in downtown Irvington. And it's just incredible to think about. But the village was faced with, what do we do about sewage? And they designed and built a major sewage plant smack in the middle of the village. And the history of this is that in 1836, New York and New Jersey established the Interstate Sanitation Commission to regulate sewage being released in the Hudson River. And a lot of this was designed to kind of focus on the harbor around New York, but it ran up the Hudson River up to north to Tarrytown, a little further north. And the commission began inspecting the few treatment plants that were there to decide whether they provided adequate treatment. And Irvington didn't have a treatment plant at the time, but they had several outfall sewers that flowed directly into the Hudson that were untreated. The village of Tarrytown, under pressure of this sanitation commission, decided to build a treatment plant, but its sewage system would only reach as far south as Pennybridge. For those of you who know, Pennybridge is just north of today's Irvington. It's kind of where the Honda plant is. If you go up Broadway, that's Sherman Road, and that's where Pennybridge was. And that was kind of as far south as the Tarrytown program would go. So in December of 1938, the village trustees decided to build a new sewage treatment plant in downtown Irvington in what was on the old Photocolor property, which had been foreclosed by the town of Greenburgh. And the work on this plant began in 1939. It was suspended for World War II and not completed until 1951. Kind of a familiar story that echoes today about the challenges of building infrastructure that takes multiple years to build, is expensive, and requires a kind of a new way of thinking. Ultimately, that sewage plant proved unnecessary. The sewage was taken over by the county, and that sewage plant was taken down, and that's now the site of the DPW for the Village of Irvington. Another interesting map post-World War II is this one focuses on traffic. And right after World War II, there was all these GIs coming back, and the village was struggling about reabsorbing all these people who wanted to live here. And how do we create a way of this new traffic to move things around? And this is a map prepared in 1946 by Edward Martin, who was the village consulting engineer. And he was trying to focus on, how do I create new arterial roads that pass through Irvington? And if you look, you see that he suggests new arterial roads running north to south, one essentially down what would be Buckout and extending up north of Buckout through up to Sunnyside. That would have been up through right through what today's Matheson Park down to Ardsley Park West. Then another arterial road that would run from today's Matheson down what is Ferris, also down to Ardsley Avenue West. And then some east-west roads, one running from Main Street across what is today Field Point, but back then was the Wood Farm, out to reaching to essentially where Cyrus Field Road was running. And then another arching kind of arterial road that would run from that on the far west down to Ardsley Avenue East. And this was an effort to think about, how do we plan for our village? Are these the way to do it? These arterial roads were not built, largely because I think of opposition from a lot of parts of the village. But it reflects again the thinking that goes on about how do we maintain our village as it is? How do we plan for the future? How do we prepare for what things will be? And then the final map I want to show you is something close to my heart, which has to do with the Irvington Woods and the Peter K. Oley Trail System. This is one of the great treasures, I think, in our village. And, as people know, that on the eastern side of our village, there's a 250-acre woodland, which is one of the largest woodland areas in southern Westchester. At the very northern end is the O'Hara Nature Center, and it offers a wide range of programs in adults and students. But that section, that northern section of the Irvington Woods, was once part of a large estate owned by the Stearns family, which extended again from Broadway out to Mountain Road. And but the fact that this northern part of the Irvington Woods is still in its natural states reflects a 30-year battle over whether this property should have been developed, whether it should have been left as woodland or developed into homes, single-family homes. And this is something where I think community involvement really has made the difference in our community because, and again, this is a whole separate talk I could do about the Stearns estate and the development of this, but this was part of what was going to be the Westwood property. And this map, which came out of our collection, actually shows the planning of what housing was going to be built in what is today the northern section of the woods. And so on the left, you see Manor Pond, which is the small pond just east of the high school. And then on the right is Peter Bont Road or Mountain Road today. And then weaving their way through all of this basically taking down this woodlands and creating this large development of single family homes. And this was debated for years and years and years and years over the impact in the village, impact housing, the environmental cost to the village, the environmental cost to the woods. And ultimately, this led to a settlement in 2003. This map's from 1995, but in 2003, in what became known as the Westwood transaction. This area that was going to be developed was actually purchased by the village and by the county for the purpose of preserving it as woodlands and parklands. And that, I think, is one of the legacies of some of the people who were involved at that time to kind of preserve this for all of us. And again, I come back to something personal today. There's a lot of people in the village who are working to continue to preserve this woodlands and the importance of engagement in our community. And again, I saw this map as an example of, there's a vision for doing something, but there's other interests at play, and people got involved, and the result, we're left with this beautiful woodlands that we can all enjoy. So I have been talking for a while, and that's kind of the end of my presentation. So let me stop sharing, and I think some of the folks are going to come back on. Hello, Michael.
Hi there. Hi. Wonderful. You really just took us through a couple of centuries there quite easily. So well done. And there's a number of folks, and you've held a rapt audience the whole way through, with many people commenting about how much they appreciate your work and how wonderful this presentation is. There are a number of questions. I think a few of them I'll share with you, but they're very specific. So unless you really have even more tremendously granular detail at the ready, it may be more about how to help people do a similar journey to what you've done on discovering information about particular properties.
Okay.
But I'll start with
you're welcome to test me. Let's see what
we'll do that. We'll do that. But
I also say this: if whatever question we don't get today, people should just email me because I can talk about all this stuff forever. So if you got specific questions, so go ahead. But go ahead.
So we're about an hour and 15 in, and so for those, I think we'll just go with the normal amount of time, about 10 to 15 minutes more. If anybody needs to go, we'll go to 5:30 and then call it a wrap at that point. But one question was, how did you physically get these maps, fragile and old and large, down to South Carolina?
So we had to think hard about that because there was a lot of concern, and not just the fact they were physical and old, but they were unique. And the minute we kind of took them out of the archives of the library and the Historical Society, there was concern. So what we concocted was we bought, there's a company whose name just popped out of my mind, but they build archival boxes, and we bought archival map boxes, which are the long flat boxes, very stiff. And then we carefully took these each maps out and put them in file folders with tissue paper between them, put them in these boxes and tried to keep them in one place so they wouldn't move around. And then working with HF Global, they had a shipping company that they were very confident would work, and we had them picked up here in Irvington and then shipped down. And then once they were digitized, they were shipped back in the same boxes and brought back to the Historical Society and to the library. And I then spent, I think, 2 days disassembling them and moving them back into the file drawers where they all are. So we spent a lot of time thinking about wanting to be very sure that if we sent these maps off, they'd come back in one piece. And I think we were very successful in doing that.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I definitely was really interested in some of the new maps. I jokingly think that anybody who's purchasing here now should see some of these older ones to see where the creeks and such used to lie that may not be so visible until heavy rains come. There was another question was that the village was incorporated in, as you said, the late 1840s and early 50s.
The village was incorporated in 1872.
In 1872, but the Dearman Park.
So let me back. The main street along Village was created in 1850, and that's when Dearman mapped it all out and sold it, and that became the hamlet of first Dearman, then Irvington. The village was legally incorporated in 1872. That's what I meant.
Very good. So the question was about the Croton Aqueduct coming right through in the 1830s and early 40s. How did that impact development?
Well,
we know the train definitely did.
Yeah. So interesting. In 1830, when New York City wanted to build the aqueduct, they got state legislation which basically allowed the city to map out its area for this aqueduct, and then compel landowners at the time to basically hand over their property so they could build this aqueduct along it. And at this time, they were largely, this was in 1837, they were mostly farms up and down that part of Westchester, including in Irvington. And, but the lasting impact of this, that building that aqueduct brought over one of the first waves of immigrants to come here, a lot of Irish immigrants and stonemasons, and many of them stayed here, and they were kind of the first wave of immigration. At that time, there really wasn't much place for them to live up here where Irvington is today. That changed with the creation of the new village of Dearman in Irvington in 1850, and part of the Main Street area, and then the area in East Clifton and also in East Irvington, that became a homestead for a lot of the new immigrants that were coming after the Civil War.
Yeah, no, I loved that information about the statistics, because we often see the old wealthy estates and are aware of the immigration, but just the numbers that you cited were very interesting. So we'll move to a test now that we've got you warmed up a little bit. So we have Ellen Fisher, who says, I grew up on the estate at 141 South Broadway, which she helpfully says is, let's see, the property opposite Nevis, just south of Hamilton Road. And she was interested in the origin of the estate. She grew up there from 59 until 1970. Her parents had bought it and created a day school there, the Wood Lane Country Day School. And she shares that her fifth grade teacher, this is a side note, was Peter Oley in his first year of teaching.
Okay, so I'm going to show you I'm going to fail miserably.
Yes.
Because I do remember that, and I knew the Woodland School. So that area originally was part of the Nevis estate. That actually, when Hamilton bought Nevis, it was on both sides of Broadway. And then starting in about 1850 or so, or a little before that, he started selling off large swaths of on the eastern side of Broadway, and for many years it was owned as large estates. 141, I'm just trying to envision in my mind exactly where that is around Hamilton Road, whether it's north or south of Hamilton. The area, and I can't remember exactly, I think it's just south of Hamilton, I believe. And that was a large estate, and I think that's where the Woodland School was. But I have, so again, I failed miserably in my details of all this stuff, but I have the history of that property mapped out. And if whoever wrote this wants to reach out to me, I can give you more information than you want.
Before we close up, we should put your slide with your email address up again. A similarly granular question, interesting from our friend Sharwago, who just presented last month to the Historical Society, asks, great presentation, Chet. Do you know anything about the school, in quotations, that shows up on the Hill and other post-Revolutionary War maps on the west side opposite the Buckout House, the west side of APR? This would have been on the Buckout, later Jewel Farm. Why a school on a leased farm?
Yeah,
You know,
so there was a I think what you're referring to was a school uh, just across from where Buckout lived, right where Harriman Road comes in. It's basically where Memorial Park is today. And there was for a period of time a school maintained there when Jewel owned the farm. I don't have a lot of, it was one of the, there was a couple of public schools. There was a public school at the southeast corner of Sunnyside and Broadway, and then this school right where just south where Station Road is today and Broadway. And again, I don't remember when it was created, and it was there for a period of time, but I'd have to go back and look exactly what time it is, but that's what it was.
all right. Well, Shar knows how to get a hold of you also. I love the map showing the businesses and your reference to it along Main Street. And my kids, they always love that when we come home when they were younger to drive down Main Street, which is usually quite quiet by 9 o'clock. But to think that there were a number of hotels and saloons back in the day, I wonder what the scene was like then. I think we're pretty close. There was another question about, those of us who've been following, the history of our region for a while. A core aspect of that is the decreasing size from, of property from very large regional to estates to, the neighborhoods that development properties you were showing us today. And I guess that speaks to, and I think you ended with one of those maps, is we have a very grid-like structure on Main Street, and then it's a bit more haphazard once you move away. And so let's see. That does seem more like a statement. I don't know if there's a question in there. I mean, I don't know if you want to add anything to
Well,
that about
so again,
the roads.
there's an evolution of the village, and it reflects the changing uh, access for the railroad, but also the changing sense of life. I think this whole concept in the late 1800s of suburbia, which today is kind of instinctively that's what we live in and stuff like that. That was a very new concept. There was a sense of people weren't used to traveling, they weren't used to commuting, and that took a while to capture itself. And this idea of separate home ownership out in the countryside. Initially, it was largely for wealthy people in large summer estates, and then it was more into villas and what was called cottages by people who live year round, but still were wealthy enough to have a couple of acres of property. And then there was housing that was being developed for a growing middle class in the 20s, Cedar Ridge, Irvington Estates, and other places like that. And so it's a constant evolution. And, again, you still see it in the village today. We're largely a single family owned zoned area. But to what extent should it remain that way? Should you have different kinds of housing, multi-use, multiple homes, stuff like that? So that dynamic and change is just part of the broader demographic evolution that you see in the greater New York area and the United States.
And then one last question, which is a good quiz question for you. We know that the trails are named in recognition of Peter Oley. Do you know anything about the history of those trails? And obviously, people can go and see different sites within the woods, but do you know any history about the trail system? It's
So a little bit. Actually, for many years, the Irvington Woods was not really used a lot. I actually mountain biked back there 30 years ago or 25 years ago a lot. And, there were a lot of trails being cut. But Peter Oley, who was a remarkable man and a great teacher in our village, he was a track coach. And he really promoted the idea and he just loved the outdoors. So he loved the woods. He got his track team to run through the woods and all these trails, and they slowly formed, both from the track team, from people like me who are biking back there and whatever, and they evolved into a set of trails. And when the Irvington, I can't remember when the village decided to call it the Peter Oley Trail System, but it's probably around 2004, I think, 2003, right after Westwood transaction. And there was a trail committee created at that time, and that evolved and became the Irvington Woods Committee. But there was a recognition of Peter's role because Peter was very active at that time still, and so that the trail committee evolved into the Woods Committee, and that trail system became more solidified, and the village acknowledged Peter by deciding to name it the Peter Oley Trail System.
while we transition here, do you want to put up your slide with your email for anybody who wants to reach you?
Let's see if I can get it back up here without screwing.
And then Veronica, if you want to turn on your camera, we're going to thank you, Chet, so much for your presentation and all your knowledge and your offer right here with your email for further questions. Everyone's welcome to reach out. And then Veronica is our Historical Society president. And if you want to turn off your slide now, Veronica will take over and share a few more words.
Okay. Can you hear me, folks?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chet, for a wonderful presentation and for all the research you've done for the Historical Society over the years. And thank you all for joining us today. Please stay tuned for a few minutes while I give you information about what's coming up in our calendar. Our annual meeting will be held on Friday, December 5th at 7 p.m. at the Main Street School. This year, we're pleased to welcome Andrew Lipman, professor at Barnard College, as our guest speaker. His talk, Squanto Native Odyssey, explores the remarkable journey of Squanto, the famous Native American who was enslaved and taken to Europe, and ultimately he returned to his homeland, forever shaping early American history. This in-person event does not require registration, and we encourage all to attend. So please come and see this wonderful speaker and attend our annual meeting. Professor Lippman's book also on the subject will be available to purchase at the event, and you may want to consider it for any of the history buffs you have on your holiday list. On Friday, December 6th, 1 to 4 p.m., we'll be joining the community celebration at the Main Street Holiday Happening. Be sure to stop by the McVicker House at 131 Main Street, which will be decorated for the holidays, and browse our stock of unique sale items. Meanwhile, have a wonderful Thanksgiving and see you all at the annual meeting on December 5th.
Thank you, Chet. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.